So it's very interesting. I haven't talked about this book in a long, long time because I've had all these other books in between. So I haven't had interviews about this. I'm really looking forward to it. It's its 20th anniversary.
Oh, yeah.
Of the release of this book. So.
Oh, wow. And you wrote it so you wrote this book 20 years after the events that it describes. You begin the writing in 1999?
Mm-hmm.
Or that's at least when you're first contacted and asked whether you'd be interested in writing a memoir. And the events that you are describing take place largely in and around the year of the Iranian Revolution of 1979.
Mm-hmm.
And towards the beginning of the book, you say, when you have been a refugee, abandon all your loves and belongings. Your memories become your belongings. Images of the past, snippets of old conversations, furnish the world within your mind. When you have nothing left to guard, you guard your memories. You guard them with silence. You do not draw your treasures into the light, lest exposure soften their sharp, sad, or gay details. The best lesson I ever learned from visiting museums. So I obviously know, but for our listeners, can you talk to us a little bit about what made you finally decide to write the memoir after 20 years?
Well, first of all, I was always very reluctant to write, primarily because I had always been a poet, and up until this book, and I always wrote in Persian. So I felt that how dare I not just switch genres, but also switch languages. And so it was never in the cards that I was going to talk about anything that I had ever witnessed. But what convinced me was the rise of a reform movement in Iran. So in 1997, President Mohammad Khatami came to office, and there was a huge celebration around his election, partly because he had really electrified a large portion of the Iranian society. And, the youth, a lot of people were completely convinced that he was the reformist. He was the true face of a future Iran that would bear no resemblance or very little resemblance to what Iran had been up until then. And I remember thinking, even when everybody was elated, including, by the way, so many people in the West who thought, he's talking about the dialogue of civilizations. He was very famous for being sort of the civilized new face of clergy in Iran. And one of the first things that he had said was that, enough about isolation of Iran. I'm interested in initiating a dialogue among civilizations. And so everybody in the West was celebrating. So it was at that time that a New York Times editorial writer, a dear friend, reached out to me and said, what do you think about all this? And so we got together, and I said, I have very little hope that this man can change anything and that any reform can possibly take place in Iran. And while I said that, I also said that I hope I will be proven wrong. But based on what I know of Iran, based on what I have observed, and based on, all the things that I have seen and read over the years, I see no possibility of this regime transforming itself in any way, shape, or form. And the editorial writer was someone who, like every other liberal in the West, was betting on Khatami to bring about change in Iran. So he challenged me, and there we began a very long series of conversations where he would ask me questions and I would answer, and they would go on, mostly via email, but every once in a while we would get together and talk in person. Until one day he said, you should really write all these things. All these things that you've been telling me over all this time deserve to be on record. And so it was at that point that I thought maybe I had something important to say, by way of offering a different record and a different account of what had happened in Iran.
Yeah. So there's so many threads to the memoir that it's a little bit hard to know where to start, but perhaps we could start here, which is, I'm noticing a lot of people have been romanticizing the political conditions in Iran under the Shah prior to the revolution. And you talk about, so in some ways, of course, under the Shah, Iran was flourishing in certain regards. As you mentioned, the GDP was much higher than that of other Middle Eastern countries. Mm-hmm. There had also been advances in the emancipation and position of women. Mm. And at one stage you talk about reading magazines and seeing these photos of Iranian women being the first woman to do various things, including one who is the queen of the nuclear reactor or something, the reactor queen. Yeah. And she is standing there surrounded by nuclear scientists. So this is quite topical at the moment. And you actually you tore out one of the pages, which was a photo of a woman who was the first long distance truck driver standing by her truck. And you said she was biting her lip in a slightly girlish manner, and she seemed like an ordinary girl, but she also had this amazing strength and defiance. So there were a lot of freedoms and economic prosperity, but nevertheless, life under the Shah should definitely not be romanticized. Do you want to talk a little bit about people's perceptions or misperceptions of that pre-revolutionary conditions in Iran?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you're correct in that there are a lot of people who are romanticizing life under the Shah, but there are also an equal number of people, especially among the diaspora, who spent their youth opposing the Shah. And they are dead set against giving up anything that they had ever thought in those days. In other words, it's become a holy matter. It's a sanctified subject that they're never willing to challenge, because it will then unravel a whole series of beliefs that they have had. Because you see, for a whole group of Iranian intellectuals, the Shah was a symbol of U.S. imperialism, and U.S. imperialism was at the time facing off against the Soviet Union, and so there was good and evil, and those who were communists and socialists in Iran saw the Shah in this much larger perspective, and therefore, for a lot of people, objecting or reconsidering their past beliefs means reconsidering all that entire order, ideology, belief system. And so they're still entrenched in everything that they believed when they were in their 20s and 30s. But, Shah's era was full of tormenting dichotomies. Tormenting in the sense that, especially when you look back from the perspective of, decades, 4 or 5 decades, you see that so many things had transformed in ways that really changed the destiny of Iran. Now, what do I mean? Iran was was a country that was so divided by various tribes and, small groups that were guarding their own interests throughout the country. And the rise of the Pahlavi dynasty brought about a sense of national identity that had not existed in Iran for a couple of centuries. Iran had a very glorious past, the Persian Empire, a very, one of the world's greatest civilizations. But it had also suffered under the rule of the Qajars, which was the dynasty that preceded the Pahlavis, and for about 200 years. And so the country had been torn apart by monarchical mismanagement, and the Russians had been plundering the Iranian resources from the north, and then the British Empire was in the south, and so the country was really in a way torn apart, not just between two great foreign powers, but also between all these tribal leaders, because everybody was out for their own interests. And so I think, perhaps in my view, one of the greatest contributions of the Pahlavi dynasty was to bring the country together and create a sense of Iranianness. And the father of the Shah, who fell in the revolution of 1979, made great strides in that regard. He was one of the first monarchs ever. If anybody else had done it before him, it has not been recorded. So he was the first monarch to actually visit a synagogue in Iran. And the idea behind this was that you're all welcome. You're all part of this country, whether you're Jewish, whether you're Christian, you're Sunni Muslims, or you're, ethnic minorities, anything. Everybody is first and foremost an Iranian. And that notion of nationhood that they created, I think, contributed in a big way to changing the destiny of Iran, especially when you look at Iran in comparison to its neighbors, in comparison to Iraq, for instance, which is still being torn apart by tribal strife, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And I think part of the reason that this didn't turn out to be Iran's destiny was that those 50 years under the Pahlavis, that sense of pride and unity that they managed to create really was very important and really shaped the nation in a very important way. And the next important thing they did several other important things, but, women's rights was certainly hugely important. The fact that women were finally given the right to go to work and participate, professionally in the life of the country. They gained divorce rights, custody rights, all these things that didn't exist. And of course, last but not least, they gained the right to dress as they wished, which didn't exist because all women, up until the rise of the first Pahlavi Shah to power, were under the veil. So these were very important, in addition to the fact that I think another thing was that so much of Iranian education was under the control of Iranian clergy. The overwhelming hold on, the schooling of children in Iran was in the hands of the local mullahs. And so suddenly there is a public education system that takes education out of the hands of clergy in Iran, which was, a huge point of contention, by the way, by the time that Ayatollah Khomeini enters the picture as sort of the face of opposition to the Pahlavis. So these things were terrible, were great, but on the other hand, no political parties were not allowed to function. There was, by the time of the second Shah, there was only one party that existed throughout the country. The press were being censored, and there was no freedom of speech, freedom of press. So these things were in such a state of paradoxical existence with the rest of the country, because I think with what should have happened in the mind of the Shah, and I know that it did occur to the minds of a lot of people who were around him, that you can't lift up a nation, in economically, educationally, and then not want them to also want freedoms. So he had not put the proverbial 2 and 2 together to figure out that once you lift a nation out of poverty, or improve their economic conditions, improve their the rates of literacy throughout the country, you can't also hold them back and say, we're going to have the censors look over your books and manuscripts, and you're not allowed to be opposed to the Shah in any way. So these two things existed simultaneously and paradoxically, and so it was a mixed bag. But in retrospect, especially looking back at what Iran has been through over the past 47 years, they do appear like forgivable sins.
Yeah. In retrospect, it's much better, but it wasn't an ideal.
Not at all.
You mentioned your own brother, who was an artist and whose work had political undertones, left Iran. This is before the revolution. He went to study in the US, I believe,
yes.
and he didn't come back. And a lot of people were. You describe an exhibition that he gave. This is one of the early parts of the book, and a lot of people at the exhibition are saying to him, "You're very talented, and maybe that's not entirely a safe thing, a good thing. I love your work, but please be careful about the kinds of commentary that you make."
Yeah.
So there was some atmosphere of fear and censorship.
Absolutely. Even and it was something that even I, as a child, sensed. So it was so present that nobody could miss it. Nobody who lived in Iran could miss it. And yes, I think ultimately, there are several reasons why, the Pahlavis were, the monarchy was dissolved, but certainly the issue of civil liberties and the absence of civil liberties had a major part in what happened. It wasn't all that created disenchantment on the part of the public, but it was hugely important, especially among the educated urban classes who had gone, to Europe and to the United States and were returning to Iran. Many of them had been sent by government funds to go get educated. So they should have been grateful for the privilege they had got to get this fabulous education. But by the time they came back to the country, they realized that they didn't have any of the freedoms that they had enjoyed while they were, wherever they were studying. And the former Shah was asked this question in an interview. Somebody, I forget who the interviewer was, says, Your Majesty, you are funding your own opposition by sending them to these, to the West, and they come back and they begin to undermine you from inside the country. And he gave a very touching answer. He said, it's the privilege of those who receive a gift to decide how they want to use the gift. He said it a lot more eloquently that I'm rephrasing now, but he even knew that this was happening, with his own funds. But yes, the issue of civil liberties played a very, very important role.
So I think there are three topics that I definitely want to cover. I'm just mapping this out now, so I manage the time correctly. The other two that we'll get to is the position of the Jewish community within Iran, and also the position of women within Iran. But I'd like to start maybe with why it was that so many people fell for the appeal of Ayatollah Khomeini. And you talk about, at the beginning of the book, you talk about this having been a love affair that turned sour. And a time that you say that one thing you want to convey is the excitement and thrill that everybody felt, that many people felt, including yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And you describe it at one point, there's this extraordinary moment when the Ayatollah is still in exile in France, and he is I'm going to read a couple of passages. At this point, this is a Muslim friend of yours, her sister and uncle, listening to a broadcast of Ayatollah Khomeini's on. It's actually a taped recording,
yes,
rather than on the radio. And this is how you describe him. Zed and I began to hear a man giving a speech, the same man, day after day. His voice had the accent of the poorly educated, drawls of the country dialect. The words were in Persian, but their meaning eluded us. The sentences were awkward, prepositions misplaced, pronouns singular in one line and plural in the next. Arabic words reared their heads among a Persian crowd. The speech did not have the melody of everyday Persian. At first it was boring, repetitive, like a lullaby, but being irreverent and contemptuous, it kept us alert and listening. The sentences circled onto themselves. The same words, the same phrases were repeated over and over, each time with only a slight shift in inflection, until they built to a crescendo, and suddenly another sound rose like a covey of pigeons cooing. It was of an audience crying. Hearing the sobs, great uncle rocked to and fro and dabbed his eyes. Bibi did not move. Her damp hair glistened, no matter how dimly the room was lit. The voice on the tape escalated to subdue the sobs, which were growing louder with the passing of every second. Now it issued rage, and the rage in turn provoked the crowd to weep even harder. That voice conducted an orchestra. It motioned them with a phrase. Cries rose. With a tiny change in pitch, it motioned again. The audience bawled, howled, Allahu Akbar! The voice assumed an imperative tone, commanding the crowd. The cries heightened into chaos, all melding to a frenzy of pleas, chants, and sobs. Slowly we began to hear parts of the speech. This world is but a passage. It is not a world in which we ought to live. This world is but a narrow path. What is called life in this world is not life, but death. And shortly after that recording, the Ayatollah sends out issues this directive that people should go to their rooftops on a particular night and turn out all of the street lights, all of the lighting, and from midnight for about an hour, people are chanting Allahu Akbar from the rooftops. And everyone, including you yourself as a young girl at this time, is caught up in this kind of mass hysteria, this weird madness of crowds, apart from your parents, who are, your dad says, how did he manage all of this, just one stinking mullah? So Could you talk maybe a little bit about what you believe were the factors that led people to fall for this? What led to this kind of enthusiasm, which encompassed people who had not been religious, who were secular, and who believed that the rule of the mullahs would be just a transient thing? And even many of those people supported the Ayatollah and later voted for an Islamic Republic. And you yourself were somewhat caught up in that excitement as a young, impressionable girl. And you were very young. You were 18 when the book ended. I think you and I are almost exactly the same age, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, tell us about how that, what you ascribe that to and how it felt.
So that's really interesting. And first of all, I'm really glad that you read these passages, because Salman Rushdie says that whenever he finishes a book, it's as if he operates lobotomy on his own brain. He takes out, the piece of his brain where he was, dealing with that story, and then puts it out. So in some ways, this happens to me also. So I haven't revisited any of this material in 20 years. Whenever I'm invited to give a book talk, I read 2 or 3 passages, exactly the same passages all the time. So some of the things you just read, I haven't heard or looked at in all these years. So I think the most important thing that actually is hugely relevant to our own time and to everything else that's happening around the world is that there had been no precursor to Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. There had been clergy in Iran who had done evil things throughout history. And perhaps if Iranians had spent more time studying their own history, they would have known better than to trust another, clerical figure. But they hadn't done their own historical homework. But on the other hand, this was an era where he was a pioneer, in that we hadn't seen an Islamic fundamentalist figure who had risen to, against a monarch, against world powers. So at the time, a lot of the Iranian secular intellectuals who were trying to make sense of him saw him as an extension of Mahatma Gandhi, saw him as an extension of all the, global liberation figures, Nelson Mandela and, all these figures who were rising and basically objecting to the West, to the colonial powers. Now, Gandhi was against the, British Empire, but there were other figures. Daniel Ortega was, in Nicaragua. And so there were these figures who were challenging Western influence. And so he appeared to the Iranian secular classes as one of that ilk, except that, he was local, so he was dressed in the local garb. Everybody dismissed the turban and the robe. And before coming to power, Khomeini didn't stop anybody, especially by the time he reached France, because he was in exile, 15 years prior to returning to Iran. He didn't stop anybody from assuming that, the turban and the robe didn't mean anything, that he was just a spiritual leader who wanted to overthrow the Shah. And beyond that, he had no other ambitions. And he had said that over and over in various interviews. He had said, all I want is to be rid of this tyranny. And then all I hope to do after that is to resume my studies at my seminary in Qom, which is sort of the Vatican of Iran for Shiites. And, in that global context, in the context of these local leaders who were rising against Western powers, he seemed to be another one of those. But, 40 years hence, after we saw, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and, ISIS and, you name it, all these other, Hezbollah, all these other Islamic fundamentalist groups, now it makes sense to rethink who he was. He was the prototype. He was the progenitor. He was the person who started all of these things. Not that, the Taliban were followers of Khomeini, but that he was the person who set the imagination of all of these characters on fire. And therefore, they began to shape their own Islamist fantasies. I remember after October 7th, there was in one of the footages that came from that horrific day, there is a Israeli girl who's being pushed into a van. Her sweatpants have been bloodied, and one of the Hamas soldiers who are pushing her into back of a van, keeps saying Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. The very words you just read.
Levy. Yeah.
Naama Levy. Yeah.
Yes.
And I heard those words and I thought, they took me back exactly to the scene that you just read, because Allahu Akbar at that age, when I was in 1978, 1979, I had never heard those words. I had heard those words, but not in that political context. And when I heard them on October 7th, I thought, they have been traveling. That sentiment, that political ideology that he introduced was, caught on like wildfire. And so hearing that, I suddenly thought Naama Levy is living through the experience that I had witnessed come into being. I think, sorry.
I was going to say that it feels to me like it's perhaps the beginnings or the first prominent example of that kind of uneasy alliance between Islam and the left. And later in the book, this is after the law mandating the hijab and other clothing specifications for women. Women had to wear a long overcoat, pants, closed-toed shoes, etc. And you cite some things from the newspaper, which are people who are secular people saying that they agreed with this imposition of the hijab, because so one says, in Algeria, even Marxist women wore veils, and now to fight imperialism, our women must wear the Islamic uniform so we can prove to the world that we are a sovereign nation. And a professor from Tehran says, personally, I condemn the rule of the bourgeoisie, but as long as the modes of production are in the hands of the exploiters, women must follow the Islamic dress code to speed up the obliteration of world capitalism. Reading those things, it just sounds so utterly nonsensical, but it's clearly something that has taken hold on certain sectors of the left. It's as if it allows them to feel part of a drama, and it gives kind of emotional vibrancy to what is otherwise quite dry intellectualism.
Yeah, I don't know if there are other authors who've had this bizarre idea that I've often had, where I look at that memoir and I say, I wish after 20 years, I could refer to this book as a piece of bygone history.
Mm.
But what is incredibly odd about that book, 20 years hence, and, I wrote it 20 years ago, or I published it 20 years ago, recollecting memories from 20 years before. So the book, in some ways, the events of the book are 40 plus years old. And I want it to be bygone history. So I would say to people, this is no longer relevant, but if you want to know how people lived 50 years ago, this might be helpful. The terrifying thing about this book is that none of it is irrelevant. And in many ways, it's far more relevant than it was when it was first published. And so one of the things that makes it so timely is the very issue that you just referred to, the way in which the Iranian left and the Iranian educated secular classes thought that embracing Islamism was a manifestation of national sovereignty, was a manifestation of national unity. And, and look at what has been happening on university campuses in the United States since October 7th. There are these, secular, smart American kids who are waving Hezbollah flags. Why? Because in their minds, this is the cause, and the cause knows, no borders, and you just embrace the whole thing. And so in some ways, I think whether by intelligent design or by accident, Ayatollah Khomeini really figured out and laid down the very sort of the map of the ideological path that we have seen some in the left and certainly Islamists have followed in order for us to be where we are in 2025. That he, in many ways, created the ideological language and convinced very smart, very educated people of why they should feel comfortable embracing Islamism, because it would allow for a nation to have a singular sense of identity and a sense of unity.
So I'm looking for another passage which really struck me. And this is Khomeini's journey back by plane. There's a kind of a very strong thematic movement in the book and a political movement as well towards this thanatocracy, this kind of idealization of martyrdom and death, which of course especially heats up during the Iran-Iraq war when young boys, 13 and 14-year-old boys, were sent out to walk through minefields and clear the way of the mines for the armies. And they were celebrated. Their faces were on posters, and they were given little plastic keys, which were supposedly the keys to heaven. So they were going on. They were sent on a suicide mission. And you also talk about the renaming of the streets in the city. So many of the streets were now named after martyrs. And so many of the public holidays were memorials to the mullahs, as you say, that they seem to die much faster than they were born, you say at one point. And so you were constantly having these officially mandated days of mourning. And there's an odd lacuna right in the center of the ideology, which is when Khomeini is on the plane, he's interviewed on his flight going back to Tehran, and the interviewer talks about how much people are longing to see him, about the flight of the Shah. So the Shah had just left, and I think it's the next day or 2 days later that the Ayatollah arrives in Tehran. And the country is poised for revolution. And he says, how do you feel at this moment? Or I think, what do you feel? Or what are you thinking and feeling? I can't remember the exact phrasing of the question. And the Khomeini says, nothing. And he says it with a kind of smirk in a voice that sounds sarcastic. He thinks carefully, he stops, he thinks, and he says, nothing. So there's this nihilism, this emptiness at the center of the ideology. And in one of the more extraordinary places in the book, you yourself contemplate suicide. So I think you're 16 at this point in the book, and you go up to the roof of your parents' house, where you had just recently witnessed this kind of everybody shouting Allahu Akbar at once, and you decide that you're going to throw yourself off the roof, and it seems like an attractive, tempting prospect to you. That it feels like the revolution is demanding a noble sacrifice from its citizens, and you're going to be part of that sacrifice. You're going to kill yourself. But you decide to write a few things down before you go, and you get so caught up in writing. You say that your little finger gets indented and becomes numb from gripping the pencil for so long that eventually you're so tired from writing all night that you fall asleep there. And when you wake up, you decide that there's no need to die because you want to write. Instead of dying, you choose writing. A very powerful passage. Do you remember how you were feeling at that moment? Do you remember the motivations for that suicide, or is it kind of a blur?
No. Actually, I feel like that was the moment I sold my late father out, because the reason I went to the rooftop was because my parents were fighting. It was in 1980, sometime around then. I was 12 or 13, and my mother was pressing my father, saying, everybody's leaving Iran except us. Why are we still staying? My mother's sister, my aunt, and her family had left, and everybody was advising us that we should leave too. And my father kept thinking that, why should we leave? This is our homeland. And he was a principal of his school. He had worked so hard in his life to get to the place where he was. So the idea of selling this home, which was one of his great accomplishments in life, I know you're saving the Jewish issue for the end, but my father had been a Jew.
Let's go to it next.
Yes. I mean, my father had been a Jew in a very small village, and to him, the idea that he had, and he was not allowed to go to school on rainy days because Jews were considered najas, or unholy, or dirty. And so the idea was that if a Jewish kid walked in the rain, and that Jewish kid would get wet, and the water splashed off of his body onto the body of the Muslim kids, he would make them dirty. So my father was a kid who was kept at home on rainy days. And so that very kid had not only gone to school, he had also gone to college, and he had been a second lieutenant in the Iranian army. He had served in the army, and he had become, he had come to the big capital, and he had become a principal, and he had bought a house in an area that at the time was was a pretty, not wealthy, but a nice middle class neighborhood. And so to tell that man that, all these accomplishments, all these strides that you've made, you abandon now and you should leave this country, was really, this is all my interpretation, must have been incredibly unbelievable to him and unacceptable. So my parents are fighting. And so the moment I sell my father out is when he gets so frustrated and so upset with my mother that he jumps into through the window of the living room into the courtyard, and he begins to take his clothes off and starts to yell at my mother and just spin around and just scream. And I had never seen my father like that. I'd never imagined that my father could do anything like that. So I ran to the rooftop and I said, look at this country. I can't recognize my country anymore, and I can't recognize my parents. So what's my reason to live? And so I decide that, this is a good time to throw myself off the roof. And yes, I begin to write and think that, this will be my final suicide note, except that I begin to enjoy it too much and get caught up in it, as you said. But an earlier idea that you referred to was this constant peddling of the notion of martyrdom and death. And again, when you kind of think about the Islamist context that has surrounded us in the past 10, 20 years, whether it was 9/11, where, a group of people decide that they're just going to, turn themselves into human missiles, or, in various incidents of these, suicide incidents that Islamists have carried out, in different parts of the world. The idea of martyrdom wasn't something that Ayatollah Khomeini invented, but popularizing it in that fashion as something that any good Muslim should aspire to was something that he should be attributed to him. He should be credited with the idea of popularizing or elevating the notion that, killing yourself is actually a privilege. And, I'm sure Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt and other underground groups were promoting such ideas. But the difference is that in Iran, he is the head of the government. He has access to all of the national communication facilities, and so he's able to be broadcast throughout the world, and so he becomes the person who not only inspires but popularizes these ideas. And I think, even under Arafat, the PLO was doing hijackings. They were hijacking planes, or they were, doing killings and assassinations. But the Intifada, in which, a killer would strap herself or himself with bombs and blow himself or herself up, didn't come about until after Khomeini had showed up on the scene. Now, is it an accident that, the first Intifada and the second Intifada and the notion of martyrdom, in the sense that it became part of a tenet to the Palestinian cause? Did it exist before that? Well, no, but did it come exactly out of Khomeini's handbook Maybe yes, maybe no, but certainly it didn't exist prior to Khomeini. So I see him as sort of the Einstein of Islamism, and I see him as sort of this grand thinker who really invents so much that is still hugely relevant and current among so many in the region and outside of the region, except in Iran. So he's no longer a role model within the country that brought him to power.
So let's talk about the Jews. Do you mind if we run over longer than an hour? Do you mind if we continue a bit longer?
That's okay. Sure.
That would be great. So we have a tiny bit in common in this, in that I spent my earliest years, not until as late in age as you did, but I spent my earliest years as a religious minority in an Islamic country in Pakistan, because I am.
What are you?
I'm a Indian Parsi, so I'm a Indian Zoroastrian, but however, the Parsis have never really been oppressed. Now within Pakistan, it's become very dangerous for any non-Muslims to live there, and most of the Parsi community have left. But within India, they're also a tiny minority, and they've always been a very successful middleman minority, but have never actually been the subject of oppression. I have wondered actually whether this is perversely because of the caste system in India, that the Indians already had a kind of internal enemy, the lower caste, that was already such a strong stigmatization there, that the kinds of things that you describe happening to your father at school, where the teacher had to demonstrate to the class that he was able to drink from the same glass of water as your father without falling ill or being contaminated. That was the thing that eventually got the students to accept your dad. That's the kind of story that I've heard from people growing up as tribals or as Dalits in India. So I'm digressing a little bit, but I just wondered whether that might have been part of what saved the Parsis from being discriminated against.
Well, so it reminds me.
Yeah.
It reminds me of something that a lot of African Americans in America started to say after 9/11, that they had been the minority that had been discriminated against, profiled by police and stigmatized in all sorts of ways, except that 9/11 suddenly introduced, the Islamist terrorists to the American society. And so, African Americans were no longer that, occupied the same sphere of stigmatized people, because there was a new group to be stigmatized. So yes, I think it's highly likely that societies have their own hierarchy of undesirables, and depending on who enters the picture, or some people get a break and others remain at the bottom for good.
Yeah, a friend of mine said that after the 7/11 bombings in London, he's a Pakistani guide, he said that whenever he got on the bus, he made sure he was carrying a well dog-eared, carefully read, clearly read and loved copy of Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion.
Right.
To deflect suspicion.
Right. That's funny.
Yeah, and a can of beer.
Right. Yeah, that. Mm-hmm.
I learned a lot about the Jewish community in Iran, which I didn't really know anything about at all. In fact, I was surprised that there's been a Jewish community in Iran for much longer than there's been a Muslim community there, which makes sense, of course. And they also had a somewhat precarious status, but a status and acceptance within Iran that they didn't have in any of the other Middle Eastern countries. We talked about the anti-Semitism that your dad faced as a child in rural Iran, but in Tehran there was a kind of slightly sort of ghettoized feeling, but Jews were successful businessmen, successful professionals, the classic successful middleman minority. And you also went to a Jewish girls' school. And that kind of, one of the things that happened immediately after that night on the rooftops that I keep referring back to, is that your father came down the next day and he saw the word Yehud painted on the wall opposite your home, and a swastika, a symbol that you had never seen before, which you described as a kind of an angry cross that seemed to be clawing at the wall, a cross that seemed to have been knocked askew and was clawing at the wall. And he immediately felt that Iran had regressed back to an earlier time before Jews were accepted, to a time of segregation and stigmatization. And that was a major moment of that was a major pivot point in the story. And I was quite surprised by the way in which the fact that the Jewish community, there were a lot of kind of different contradictory things going on. So for one thing, a group of Jews came and made a petition to Ayatollah Khomeini and stated their loyalty to Iran and said, we're different from those other Zionists. We're not political Zionists, which was a term that was invented, you say, actually by the Iranian Jews who wanted to avoid being victimized in Khomeini's Iran, and also genuinely felt that Iran was their home rather than having any allegiance to Israel. Would you like to talk a little bit about the Jewish experience growing up in Iran?
Yes. So first of all, it's an important piece of history to remind everybody, including the Jewish community, because many of them that I've encountered in the United States ask me where I'm originally from. And when I say, they say, oh, we didn't know that there were Jews in Iran. And I find that as shocking as they find my being a Jew from Iran, shocking to them, because the Babylonian exile ended with Jews finding sanctuary in ancient Persia, and the king of Iran, who Cyrus the Great, who provided sanctuary, has been mentioned in the great holy Jewish texts as a major savior of Jews in the ancient times. So it is against that backdrop of Jewish existence that the idea that Jews are being completely eradicated from Iran, incredibly tragic, and also tragic not just for Jewish community, tragic also for Iran, because so much of what has distinguished Iran as a society very different from the Arab societies that it's surrounded by, it has been manifested in the idea that Iran has been home to so many different ethnicities and religious minorities. And so the absence of the Jewish community, the fact that Jews have gone from being a community of 100,000 plus at the time of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 to something close to only 8,000 or 9,000 in a nation that is now, edging at 90 million, means that Iran is losing that sense of Persian identity that it had kept, not only by way of keeping Persian as a distinct language, Persian culture as a distinct culture, but also Persian society as a distinct society because of showing so much tolerance to allow for coexistence of so many different minority groups, be it ethnic or religious. So it is tragic on multiple levels, but I think at the end of the day, it's most tragic for Iran because now it's blending in with everyone else in the region, whereas for 2,500 years, the notion of upholding a distinct Persian identity has been a cornerstone of the Iranian identity. So that aside, the Jewish Iranians had, in the 50s and the 60s and 70s, lived through a golden era because prior to the 50s, the 60s, prior to the reign of the Pahlavis, they were treated as people of the book, which meant that they were a legitimate religious minority that could continue to do their own religious practices, but they were considered, as Jews were considered in other Islamic societies, they were considered dhimmis, or in some ways they were considered dhimmi as in lesser citizens. And so they were, they lived in a Jewish ghetto in Tehran, for most of the 19th and early part of the 20th century. So it was with the rise of the Pahlavis to power that the ghettos were dismantled. Actually, I shouldn't say dismantled. The ghetto in the south of Tehran, the Jewish ghetto, still existed. It never had any official walls. So, it wasn't like Venice where there were gates that would be shut at the end of the day. But it was a distinct area where Jews were living in south of Tehran, and it was a very poor neighborhood. But they simply left after, the Pahlavis came to power and were able to lift themselves out of that neighborhood, out of poverty, and begin to participate in, go to school, get educated, and immediately, within the span of a decade or so, they were among the middle class and the upper classes of Iran. So those were, those 2 or 3 decades were incredibly important in the life of Iran at large, but also in sort of creating a possibility of open Jewish existence that had never existed, at least not for 200-300 years.
So at university, or at least I think you're 18, 19 by the end of the book, and you join this Iranian Jewish students organization.
Yes.
And you're campaigning about injustice in various places. For example, you're concerned about what's happening in Chile under Pinochet. apartheid South Africa, and even you said the Palestinians in Israel, because you didn't consider yourself Zionist or connected in any way with Israel. And for a while, it seemed as though you would be able to lead your own little separate Jewish revolution within the Iranian Revolution untouched. And there's actually a kind of symbolic moment where this absolutely mad religious woman takes over. So I'm going back slightly in the chronology, but an absolutely crazy religious woman takes over your Jewish girls' school, becomes the principal. It's a very, very funny chapter of the book. She gives this extraordinary speech. Let me see if I can find it.
Did you ever read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man?
Yes, I have read that.
Okay, so
so she's and she at one point gives you this long lecture about the veil, and it's the kind of the last straw. She's talking about the hijab, and she's actually in tears. She's so emotional, telling you about the deep and horrific evil that dwells within each of you, and which could ruin the country and everybody's lives and send everyone to hell. And then she reveals towards the end of this speech what the great evil is, and she says, it's hair. It's your hair. And she says she wants to prepare you. Instead of fire drills, she says that she's going to have man drills, which are basically exercises in which you have to adjust your dress and make sure you're kind of as covered up as possible. And she says, learn this and you have bought yourselves a one-way ticket out of hell. If a man were to walk into this room, I, naked as I feel without my veil, would have no choice but to pull the hem of my Islamic uniform over my head. And you say to yourselves, but Mrs. Moghadam would be exposing her body. But at that moment of emergency, when I have not even a second to lose, I must cover my head better than any other part. Yeah. So girls, if I scream, man, what must you do? Run if you can. And if you can't, hide. And if you can't hide, surrender and pull the hem of your uniforms over your heads. Just so you never forget, I'll demonstrate. Tug at my scarf, bring it back, reveal my forehead, even the edge of my hairline. See? But no, that is not the edge of my hairline. It is the edge of the apocalypse. You heard me right. Pull it forward to the edge of my eyebrows and we're restored to our earthly lives. Back, the flames rise, the apocalypse nears. Forward, we can resume our earthly life. Back, doom, annihilation. Forward, we live. Back, the netherworld. Forward, life. And she actually has to stop there because she's so overcome and out of breath, and she has to sit down and have a glass of water brought to her. And you actually managed to mount this rebellion against Mrs. Moghadam. And the girls are unafraid of her. It's very telling because the girls are unafraid, but the teachers are very afraid because they understand that Mrs. Moghadam, even though she's just such a caricature, it's got a kind of Benny Hill-esque sort of way to it. She would show men her ass so that she could cover her, she would lift her hijab up so high she would cover her head. It's kind of absurd. And the girls see it as absurd, but the teachers know that this is the beginning of totalitarian imposition. They are frightened. And that's something that is repeated again, that we see at various points in the book. Your kind of childlike and girlish enthusiasm and idealism and kind of belief in yourself is just it's just shattered repeatedly. And this happens again with the Jewish-Iranian Students Organization. That in the end, you end up being all hauled up before this committee, and you're brought back into line with Islamic teaching. And that is, towards the end of the book, the kind of creeping totalitarianism that began with just politics and religion and enabled you to carve out these little niches for yourselves as Jews and as women and as young people. All of those loopholes are being closed, and the Ayatollah announces a new jihad, a jihad against the self. So that's that totalitarian impulse controlling of your emotions, your thoughts, your pastimes. You're not allowed to go hiking anymore up in the mountain. The mountain is closed. So that's what happens towards the end of the book.
Yes. So, I read that very passage. It's one of the, I mentioned earlier that there are 2 or 3 passages I always read. This is one of them.
Yeah.
and so, I read it the first time for a crowd, and it was, I think, a library and group.
I'm sorry, I should have just let you read it.
No.
I
So enjoyed hearing you. It's wonderful to hear how other people perceive these lines, and I so enjoy listening to you read. But I read it to this adult group at a library the first time around, and I realized that what I'm reading, which to me is comical, is terrifying them, because they recognize exactly what the teachers were recognizing, which is that this seemingly absurd setup is the beginning of the rise of totalitarianism in Iran. But what they were missing, and what I was not conveying in kind of framing the passage for my audience, was to say the only way we could survive that incredibly terrifying time was by being our youthful selves, because otherwise, the fear would paralyze us. And so I think, if anybody asked me ever, what is your advice for somebody who's living under an authoritarian regime, what is your advice for survival? I would say, the best way is if you're 14, because otherwise it's intolerable. But when you're 13, 14, and 15, it all looks as it should to everybody, which is entirely absurd. So she was entirely absurd, and she was wholly ambitious. So she had, her intention was to build an Islamist resume. So converting a school of Jewish kids to Islam, which is what she had hoped to do, would be a great thing on her resume. And then I thought she was only an anomaly, and God knows that only I and my peers had witnessed this, and nobody else knew about it, except that I met a Christian-Iranian who was exactly my age, and he had read the book. And we met at an event, and he said, after she left your school, she came to our school. So, so after leaving the Jews, she had moved on to school for Christians, and had done the very same thing to his group of, Christian kids, trying to convert them. And then she ran for Majlis. She ran for the Iranian parliament, and she, I think at some point while she was on the bus campaigning, she had an accident and died. But this was part of what, sort of this Islamist fervor that that came after the revolution. And it, as much as it appeared in early on that, Jews were considered people of the book and they could continue their practices and do as they wish, I think there were a few years immediately after the revolution that the regime hadn't actually decided what it was going to do with the Jews and with other religious minorities. And so there were these, on one hand, there was this message that Jews are people of the book and they can practice in Iran and live. But on the other hand, there would be these unofficial assaults on the Jewish community, and the assignment of this principal to a Hebrew day school in Tehran was one of those manifestations. Another manifestation was that Jews were not banned from leaving Iran, but 9 out of 10 Jews who in the early 80s, including my dad, who went to receive their passports to leave Iran, would be denied their passports. And when anyone asked for a reason why, they would say, oh, nothing, we're just reviewing, come back in 6 months. So there would not be an official decree to say, Jews have lost the right to X, Y, and Z, but there would be these unofficial ways in which life had become difficult for the Jewish community, and receiving exit visas or passports to leave Iran was one of them. And then, limitations that were created at Jewish day schools was another. Now, the irony is, and this is something I wrote about recently, that as the regime became far more confident in its own, power, and it matured over the years. It wasn't that young post-revolutionary radical regime anymore. It was a mature radical Islamist government. Then they picked on the Jews a lot less, because as they matured and became more powerful, the Jewish community shrank and shrank and shrank. And at some point, and I think it was going back to the start of our conversation, at some point they recognized that they shouldn't lose all of the Jewish community, because if they are trying to be the bearers of this mantle of Islamic tolerance, then they need to have some Jews in Iran to prove that they are tolerant, to the world, because Jews now become a tool for them to make certain very important arguments before the global community. Because now they can say, if we are anti-Israel, you should know that it's not because we are anti-Semitic. Look, we have a Jewish community in Iran. If we were anti-Semitic, would we have Jews? So at some point, which I think it took a couple of decades, they recognized that having Jews was good PR for the regime. And it allowed them, before the global community, at the United Nations, when they, showed up for, the annual meeting, they often brought the Jewish representative in the Iranian parliament. And that was their way of saying, we are anti-Israel, but look, we have Jews in Iran, so we are not anti-Semitic. So the Jewish community became an important political tool. And therefore, they began to allow the Jewish community certain things that they weren't allowing in the beginning of the revolution. So in the beginning of the revolution, they did not allow the Jewish community to appoint their own principal to the school or have run their own administration, which is why we ended up with this freakish woman as our principal. But, 20 years into, the revolution, 20 years into their reign, they recognize that they can give certain liberties to the Jewish community and brag about Jewish existence in Iran.
Yeah. It's a couple of things that really struck me, which I couldn't find a place to put them in the conversation, so I'm just going to say them now. And one is that it's really interesting to hear the revolution happening while you are going through the turmoil of puberty and adolescence and teenagehood. And I was thinking a lot as I was reading, particularly the descriptions of your friend's sister, Bibi, who I described in that earlier passage that I read. You describe her listening to the Ayatollah Khomeini's speeches on a tape recorder. And it was reminding me of what Camille Paglia says about the tendency of adolescent women to get swept up in religious fervor, that all of the feelings and developments that are happening in your body, all the kind of passion that you're feeling can easily get directed in a religious direction, in a direction that Camille Paglia puts it is anti-nature, because the turmoil caused by nature ironically sends you in a direction that is totally against nature into religion. And it feels as though the revolution, I think that's one of the more unique things about the book is, although I'm very struck by all of the horror of the revolution, and I'm reading the book like most readers with a sense of how bad things are going to get, I nevertheless haven't read a book that also captured a kind of feeling of excitement and optimism that of course went very wrong later, but that was present there at the beginning, that kind of sense of fervor. For example, I recently read Reading Lolita in Tehran, which I thought was an amazing book, but is written from the point of view of an adult, a university professor, and it's deep into the revolution, and she's in midlife when the revolution happens, and she's under no illusions about what it means right from the outset. And whereas you capture this kind of youthful naivety and buoyancy, and it feels as though for a moment there, this is actually before the revolution happens, but for a moment there also, it feels as though there is a unique opportunity for the modernization of Iran. This is still under the Shah. I'm going to read a little passage, and I think this passage is very typical of one mode of your writing, which is common, recurring throughout the book, which is this magic realist feel. I think your people will realize what I mean by magic realist when I read this passage. Even though there's nothing supernatural going on, the language and atmosphere that you create is that same atmosphere of magic realism, which is the sense of an eternal kind of cycle that you have a chance of breaking out of
possibility
at the moment
yes.
of the book. Yeah. So that's how
that
it feels
anything
reading.
Is possible still. Yes.
Yeah, that's how it feels reading 100 Years of Solitude, and it's got that same very very much that same feel here.
Except that I don't use magic.
No, you don't use magic.
Right. But
so
that sense is there.
Yeah, this sense of a kind of really long-standing tradition that could be broken. There's just this moment of hope when you have the first female truck driver and things. There's just this moment of kind of hope, which is just completely dashed by what happens later. And you're describing the women in your Jewish family. And you say, we were the only girls in the extended maternal family. This is you and your cousin, Farah. Farah was well on the road, and I was trailing her. Her destination would be my destination. The women before us were grandmother, Aunt Zarin, and mother. And where were they now? At motherhood. A place with suffering to the north, suffering to the south, suffering to the east, and suffering to the west. Motherhood was the only mark of their femaleness. I had watched grandmother, Aunt Zarin, and mother long enough to know that grim geography. They served the family freshly cooked meals while they stayed in the kitchen and ate yesterday's leftovers. After the meals, the men slipped into their pajamas and napped. The women cleared the plates and swept around the bodies, like nurses in an infirmary tending to comatose patients. Pain was their closest companion. They welcomed it, grabbing the handle of a searing pan without mittens. If they cut themselves, they spared the call to the doctor, even the band-aid, and insisted, grimacing in pain, that all bleeding would stop with a steady application of pressure. Only the purple stain of iodine or the red trace of mercurochrome told of the wounds they had suffered quietly. Mother's migraines came and went with just a tight scarf appearing and disappearing around her head. Otherwise, she stood at the sink as she did every day and washed dishes in cold water. We must have lived in terribly dirty times because the women were forever washing. Soap suds were permanently lodged in the crevices of their rings. Grime dulled their jewellery, the way safety pins holding the straps of their slips diminished the allure of their lingerie. Their bras were depositories for banknotes and shopping lists, anything but a tender form. No matter how glamorously they dressed, something would be awry, a button missing, a bulky sweater covering a party blouse to protect their backs from a draft. Some worry, some dark thought always engulfed their faces and eclipsed their shimmering gowns. These expressions dominated their faces no matter how hard they tried to smile for the photographers to leave a positive impression on the negatives. Motherhood was a melancholy affair. Mothers were martyrs, everyone knew it, and no one expected less of them. Men suffered and sacrificed themselves only in poetry for the sake of love. In real life, women were the ones to perform these legendary acts. The words that described a model woman were charged with muted stillness. Demure was the most spirited. The rest conjured lethargy at best. So-and-so carries herself in an admirably weighty manner. And before I was told not to take weighty literally, it had already burdened me. So-and-so's voice will not be heard past her eyebrows. Quietness was celebrated. And I began to keep so many cries of joy inside I feared for my chest. Every year on Mother's Day, the national radio broadcast this special message. Salutations upon all mothers. The promised paradise is under your feet. Mothers would be delivered to happiness only upon death. So they rushed the inevitable. In sickness, it was Mother who fearlessly leaned close to me, stroked me and whispered, "May Mother never see your pain. May your aches leave your body and enter mine instead. May I die and never see you ill." All of 5 feet and 2 inches, she threw me over her shoulder like a girl's shawl and carried me to the bathroom. When she ran out of affection, she recited poetry, those tributes to motherhood she cherished. Some I knew from my school texts, so I recited them along with her. The most rhythmic, one we both knew well, was a poem about a son in love, who was ordered by his beloved to cut out his mother's heart as the proof of his devotion. But running to his beloved, the boy hurt his foot against a rock, and the still beating heart of his mother lamented, "Alas, my dear son's foot is hurt. Alas, my dear son has taken a fall." A really extraordinary passage. This is right before your cousin Farah gets married, and she marries a Muslim man, and he is...
She marries a Jewish man.
He's Jewish, her husband?
Yeah.
sorry.
So my uncle, marries,
Your uncle
wants to marry,
wants to
wants to
marry.
marry,
Sorry,
and not
I got that
non-Jewish
confused.
woman. Yes.
Yeah, and the man she marries is incredibly cruel, and probably also, you say later, he had spent time in psychiatric care. He clearly had his psychiatric issues. And he's angry because he feels that she doesn't bleed enough on their wedding night. And that's a sign that she might have lost her virginity beforehand. Absolutely extraordinary and horrific. You give an extraordinary and horrific account of that. As you rush to the hospital where he has insisted that she is examined by the doctors. But yeah, so it's not a kind of, the revolution doesn't destroy an idyll that was there to begin with. It's really about lost possibilities for women, for yourself, for the Jewish community, for Iran as a country.
Yes, so I'm thinking through as you're reading, and trying to think about what it was that allowed me to infuse the book with a sense of, well, first of all, humor, or some sense of wit or levity, and also, at least for certain portion of the book, a sense of possibility and hope. Part of it was because when I first thought about writing this book, I kind of went about it in a reverse manner. I thought, okay, imagine you have the final product, and I hadn't picked up the pen yet, but imagine you have the final product. How do you want the reviews to read? And I looked at the back of a bunch of women, Middle Eastern women memoirs, and the words that ran through so many of those reviews were a harrowing account of a harrowing account. And I thought, whatever I write, the last thing in the world I want my book to be called is a harrowing account of anything. And so I reverse engineered the book in some ways so it wouldn't be called a harrowing account, because not only that's not what I wanted my book to be remembered as, but also that's not how life was. And that's sort of the incredible, unimaginable magic, if there was any magic, of living under authoritarianism, which was that, at least at the time, we lived through it, but we also denied it in a certain, by our small routine actions. So, anybody who's gone to Iran, from the United States and Europe, says the moment we were picked up by a cabbie from the airport, he started, ranting against the regime, or and we started wondering how these people aren't getting arrested by the authorities, except that we realized that there are so many of them who are ranting. So there was, life hadn't become something that we still couldn't enjoy or have a sense of wonder about it. And I think that was a really something that I still observe about Iran as a whole, that yes, all the atrocities that we hear about go on, but so is, a general sense of liveliness and creativity and all that is sort of underneath as well. I can't help but think about the second thing that made shaping the book in this way possible. I can't help but think about, like, the work of Anne Frank. Why do we keep reading Anne Frank? Because somehow in the midst of all the darkness and from, the bottom of this incredibly grim circumstances that has surrounded her, she still finds reasons to hope or to find good in the world. And I think that's the advantage of being, a 13-year-old, a 14-year-old, someone who has yet to be tainted by, by the experience of life's, tragedies. And I think I try to capture that sense, that youthful view that made tolerating all of this or living through it not just possible, but also in some ways, humorous, because we laughed all the way through, the lectures by the principal. We laughed all the way through, the mountain climbs where we were being chased by members of the Revolutionary Guards who eventually arrested us. And we laughed all the way as we were in detention and then were later released. I don't think we could have survived any of it had we been, slightly older.
Yeah. Do you think that one of the reasons for the resilience of the Iranians is the feeling that this is a different culture that's been imposed upon you from outside, as opposed to a kind of a Persian culture that is pre-Islamic that's still very much alive in people's minds?
I certainly felt that way, and in the passage that you read about Khomeini's speech, I try to express that. It was incredible to me that they were speaking the same language, but it just didn't feel the same. That even though we could identify, I knew the meaning of the words they were using, but when you added up the words, it didn't add up to the same sounds, the same Persian expression that I was used to. So it did, for a very long time after the rise of Khomeini to power, they were intent on Islamicizing Iran. And they were trying to use it through misuse of Persian, and injecting Arabic words into, daily Persian speeches. I mean, they would, say in English, we have several words, several synonyms for the same word, and they would reach for the Latin version, so to speak. So they would reach for the Arabicized version of a perfectly good Persian word. And there was a war that they waged initially against the Persian traditions of Iran. Now you're a Parsi, so you know that the Iranian New Year is a pagan tradition, is a Zoroastrian tradition that marks the start of spring, and happens on March 21st every year. One of the first things that Khomeini tried to do was to say, let's do away with this, pagan tradition. We're a Muslim nation. And this is early on in his reign, when he was still a beloved figure, or at least a feared figure. So, people wouldn't object to him back then. And still, people completely rebelled against, that assertion that they were going to give up Nowruz, the Persian New Year.
Mm.
And when you look at what has happened in Iran, or how the regime is trying to unify the nation after the war, the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, they're trying to unify the nation with the use of Persian symbolism, because and it's incredibly ironic, because here is a regime that has been Islamicizing everything since they came to power, and all of a sudden, since the end of June, they are reaching for pre-Islamic kings of Iran. They're making posters out of the busts of Cyrus and Xerxes, and they're forming creating posters from pre-Islamic texts, Persian texts, because they realize and they know that the Islamist propaganda or Islamist symbolism isn't something that they can bring the nation together around, but the Persian symbolism, be it literature, be it historical relics, are the very things that can unify the nation. And now, incredibly shockingly, this regime that has been doing its best to bury all of that has been bringing out, creating posters out of the tomb of Cyrus the Great, and and the columns at Persepolis, and with the poetry of one of Iran's greatest poets, who actually, it's somewhat of a Homer, a Persian Homer, except that the war he was writing. No, that was Ferdowsi. He preceded Hafez, but he was, if he was a Homer for Iran, it was because he was memorializing the story of the Islamic assault on Iran. So they're reaching for the very same guy to stir nationalistic feelings.
Yeah. Roya, is there anything that you hoped I would ask you or wanted to talk about that you haven't had a chance to?
No, this was incredibly moving for me, because I have not revisited the book, and the fact that you were reciting these things really stirred me. So thank you. It was it was a very wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much. I absolutely loved the book, and I do feel kind of a spiritual connection with Iran, even though I've never been. I'm holding up the book here, so I can take a screenshot later. And thank you so much for joining me.
Yes, it was great. Thank you.